My friends, if there's one truth we must embrace, it's that God's greatest blessings often come wrapped in hardship. It's easy to wonder why. Why does the struggle come before the breakthrough? Why does the storm rage before the calm? Why must we walk through the valley before we reach the mountaintop? The answer is woven throughout Scripture. Over and over we see men and women of God facing trials that seemed insurmountable until God showed up. Joseph was betrayed, enslaved, and imprisoned before he was elevated to lead Egypt. Moses wandered the wilderness for 40 years before stepping into his calling. Even our Lord Jesus endured the cross before the resurrection. Hardships are not signs of God's absence, but evidence of His refining work. When we face trials, we are not being abandoned, we are being prepared. The weight of our struggle is the weight of the blessing that is coming. Like gold in the fire, we are being purified. Like a seed in the soil, we are being made ready to bear fruit. Perhaps you find yourself in a season of difficulty right now. The prayers seem unanswered. The road seems long, the burden feels heavy, but hear this, God is not done yet. The trials you face today may be the very testimony that changes lives tomorrow. The pain you endure now may be the preparation for a purpose beyond what you can imagine. Remember, God sees what we cannot see. He knows what we do not know. He is working in ways we do not yet understand. If we had everything handed to us without struggle, we would never develop the faith to trust Him in the valleys. If we never faced the storm, we would never witness His power to calm it. So hold on. Stay faithful. Keep praying. Keep trusting. Your hardship is not your end. It is your foundation for the next great work of God in your life. And when the blessing comes, when the door finally opens, when the breakthrough arrives, you will know it was God all along, shaping you, strengthening you, and leading you into the fullness of His plan. Life often brings seasons of hardship that feel overwhelming, discouraging, and even unfair. It's in those moments that doubt begins to creep in, whispering questions that shake the foundation of faith. Why is this happening? Where is God in all of this? Why does it feel like every step forward is met with another setback? But what if the very struggles we face are not obstacles meant to break us, but tools meant to prepare us for something greater? What if the hardships we endure are actually positioning us to receive the very blessings we've been praying for? Throughout Scripture, this pattern is evident. God rarely hands out blessings without first leading His people through a process of testing and refinement. Consider the life of Joseph. As a young man, he had a God-given dream that he would rise to a position of great authority. But before he ever stepped into that promise, he was betrayed by his brothers, thrown into a pit, sold into slavery, falsely accused, and imprisoned. For years, it seemed like everything in his life was moving in the opposite direction of the dream God had placed in his heart. Yet in the midst of every hardship, God was working behind the scenes, shaping Joseph's character, preparing him for leadership, and positioning him for the exact moment when he would be elevated to second in command over Egypt. Had Joseph not gone through those trials, he wouldn't have had the wisdom, humility, or faith to handle the immense responsibility of the blessing that was coming. The same is true for Moses. Before he became the great leader who would deliver Israel out of slavery, he spent 40 years in the wilderness tending sheep. That season of isolation and difficulty was not wasted time, it was God's training ground. Moses was learning how to lead, how to depend on God, and how to persevere in the face of adversity. The hardship came first, but the blessing followed. Jesus Himself, the Son of God, faced unimaginable suffering before stepping into the greatest victory of all. The cross came before the resurrection. The pain came before the glory. If even Christ had to walk through hardship to fulfill His purpose, how much more should we expect seasons of difficulty before stepping into God's greater plans for our lives? Hardships have a way of stripping away self-reliance and drawing us closer to God. They teach us to pray more fervently, to trust more deeply, and to lean not on our own understanding, but on God's wisdom. When everything is easy, faith is not tested. But when we walk through the fire and still choose to trust God, our faith is strengthened, our endurance grows, and our hearts become ready to receive the blessings He has in store. Many times, people give up right before their breakthrough. The weight of the struggle convinces them that God has forgotten them, that the promise will never come to pass. But what if Joseph had quit in the prison? What if Moses had given up in the wilderness? What if Jesus had turned away from the cross? The blessings were just on the other side of the hardship. The same is true today. What seems like an impossible situation may be the very thing God is using to prepare you for a blessing you never imagined. God does not waste our pain. Every difficulty, every trial, every setback is part of a greater purpose. No suffering is meaningless in His hands. What the enemy means for harm, God uses for good. That difficult job, that unexpected loss, that season of waiting, none of it is in vain. It is shaping, refining, and preparing you for something greater. When the time is right, when the work in you is complete, the blessing will come. And when it does, you will look back and realize that the hardships were never meant to destroy you, but to prepare you for the very thing you've been praying for. The Bible is filled with stories of men and women who faced overwhelming hardships before stepping into the blessings God had prepared for them. These stories are not just ancient history, they serve as powerful reminders that God's ways are often different from our own. He does not always lead his people on the easiest path, but he always leads them on the right one. Through trials, he refines, strengthens, and prepares his children for the blessings that lie ahead. Joseph's story is one of the clearest examples of this truth. As a young man, he had a vision from God that he would rise to a position of authority, but his journey to that destiny was anything but smooth. Betrayed by his own brothers, sold into slavery, falsely accused, and thrown into prison, Joseph endured years of suffering. It would have been easy for him to believe that God had abandoned him, but in reality, God was preparing him. Each hardship taught him something: humility, perseverance, faith, and leadership. When the time was right, God elevated him to the second highest position in Egypt, placing him in a position to save his family and countless others from famine. Without the hardships, Joseph would not have been ready for the responsibility of the blessing. Moses' life also demonstrates this pattern. He was raised in Pharaoh's palace, enjoying the privileges of royalty, but when he tried to take matters into his own hands and deliver the Israelites by force, he ended up fleeing into the wilderness. For 40 years, he lived as a shepherd, far removed from the power and influence he once had. To many, it might have seemed like his story was over, but God was not finished. The wilderness was not a punishment, it was preparation. In that time, Moses learned patience, dependence on God, and leadership skills that he would later use to lead Israel out of Egypt. His hardship came before his calling, and when God finally spoke to him from the burning bush, he was ready. The life of David follows the same pattern. Anointed as the future king of Israel, while still a young shepherd, he did not immediately step into the throne. Instead, he spent years on the run, hiding in caves, fleeing from King Saul, and facing constant danger. He could have questioned why God allowed him to endure so much suffering when he had already been chosen to be king. But God was molding him into a leader with deep trust in him. Those years of hardship made David the man who would one day rule Israel with wisdom, humility, and faith. Even Jesus, the Son of God, faced suffering before stepping into his glory. He endured rejection, betrayal, false accusations, and the agony of the cross before the triumph of the resurrection. If there was ever a moment when suffering seemed unjust, it was when the sinless Son of God bore the weight of the world's sin. But even in that darkest moment, God's purpose was being fulfilled. The suffering was necessary for salvation, and through his sacrifice, Jesus secured the greatest blessing of all, eternal life for those who believe in him. These examples are not just historical accounts, they are a pattern of how God works in the lives of his people. Hardship is not the end of the story, it is the preparation for the next chapter. When trials come, it is not a sign that God has abandoned his people, but rather that he is working to refine and prepare them for something greater. Every struggle has a purpose, every difficulty carries a lesson, and every hardship is a stepping stone toward the fulfillment of God's promises. It is easy to wish for the blessing without the process, to desire the reward without the struggle. But the process is what makes the blessing meaningful. Without the hardships, Joseph would not have had the wisdom to rule Egypt. Moses would not have had the patience to lead Israel. David would not have had the strength to be king, and Jesus would not have brought salvation to the world. The struggle comes before the blessing because God's work in us must be completed before his work through us can begin. Hardships have a way of revealing what is truly inside a person. When everything is easy, it is simple to trust God, to have faith, and to walk in joy. But when trials come, when prayers seem unanswered, when the road becomes difficult, that is when real faith is tested and refined. It is in those moments of difficulty that God shapes and strengthens his people, preparing them for the blessings he has in store. Without challenges, there is no growth. Without struggle, there is no strengthening. Without trials, there is no testimony. Gold is purified by fire. When raw gold is placed into intense heat, impurities rise to the surface so they can be removed, leaving behind something pure and valuable. The same is true for people. When life is comfortable, there is little reason to change, little reason to develop character or deepen faith. But when hardships come, they expose weaknesses, test convictions, and force growth. The struggles are not meant to destroy, but to refine, to remove anything that does not align with God's purpose. The Bible is filled with examples of people who had to be strengthened before stepping into their God-given destiny. Peter, one of Jesus' closest disciples, was bold and outspoken, but he also had flaws. He was impulsive, quick-tempered, and at times fearful. When Jesus was arrested, Peter denied knowing him 3 times, despite having sworn he never would. That moment of failure could have defined him, but instead it refined him. Through that hardship, Peter was humbled. He realized that his strength was not enough. He needed to rely fully on God. After Jesus restored him, Peter became one of the most powerful preachers of the early church, boldly proclaiming the gospel despite threats and persecution. His hardship did not break him, it strengthened him. Paul's life tells a similar story. Once a fierce persecutor of Christians, he encountered Jesus on the road to Damascus and had his entire life transformed. But from that moment on, his life was not easy. He was imprisoned, beaten, shipwrecked, and faced countless dangers. Yet, instead of becoming bitter, he grew stronger in faith. He learned that suffering produced endurance, endurance produced character, and character produced hope. He discovered that God's strength was made perfect in weakness, that trials were not obstacles but opportunities to experience God's power in new ways. David, before becoming king, had to endure years of hardship. Though he had been anointed as the next ruler of Israel, he spent much of his early life running from King Saul, hiding in caves, and facing betrayal. It was in those difficult years that David developed the character of a true king. He learned patience, trust in God's timing, and reliance on God's protection. When he finally took the throne, he was not just a man with a title, he was a leader with a heart after God. The hardships prepared him for the weight of the blessing. Even Jesus, though sinless, experienced trials that strengthened him for his purpose. He fasted in the wilderness for 40 days, resisting the temptations of the enemy. He faced rejection from his own people, endured the pain of betrayal, and suffered on the cross. Through it all, he remained faithful. His hardships were not signs of weakness, but proof of his strength. He endured so that he could fulfill his mission, bringing salvation to the world. When hardships come, it can be tempting to ask, why is this happening? But a better question is, what is God doing through this? Every challenge is an opportunity to grow. Every struggle is a chance to build character. Every trial is a moment to develop endurance and faith. The difficulties of today are preparing the blessings of tomorrow. Those who allow God to work in them through their hardships will find that their faith is stronger, their character is deeper, and their trust in God is unshakable. There are moments in life when it feels as if God is silent, as if prayers go unanswered, and as if everything is working against the promises He has given. In those times, doubt creeps in, and it becomes easy to question whether God is truly at work. But just because His hand is not always visible does not mean He is not moving. God operates in ways beyond human understanding, orchestrating events, aligning circumstances, and shaping people for the blessings that are yet to come. What may seem like a delay is often divine preparation. What appears to be a setback is frequently a setup for something greater. Joseph did not see the full picture when he was thrown into a pit by his brothers. He could not have imagined in that moment of betrayal that God was positioning him for leadership in Egypt. When he was sold into slavery, falsely accused, and left in prison, it must have felt like everything was falling apart. But behind the scenes, God was aligning every detail. He was using every hardship to prepare Joseph for the exact moment he would be needed to interpret Pharaoh's dream and save an entire nation from famine. What seemed like random suffering was actually divine strategy. The Israelites had no idea what God was doing when they wandered through the wilderness for 40 years. To them, it likely felt like an endless journey with no destination in sight. But God was not just leading them, He was shaping them. He was teaching them to rely on Him for daily provision, molding them into a people who would trust Him fully before they stepped into the promised land. If He had taken them straight from Egypt to Canaan, they would not have been ready for the blessings that awaited them. Their time in the wilderness was not wasted, it was necessary. Esther did not know that God was preparing her for a critical moment in history when she was chosen as queen. She could not have predicted that her position in the palace would one day be the key to saving her people from destruction. But when the time came, she realized that everything had been leading to that moment. She had been placed there for such a time as this. Every event, every twist in her journey was part of God's plan, even when it was not clear to her at the time. God's ways are higher than human ways. His thoughts are higher than human thoughts. The pieces of life's puzzle do not always make sense when viewed up close, but when the full picture is revealed, it becomes clear that nothing was random, nothing was wasted, and nothing was without purpose. He is always working, even in the waiting. He is always moving, even in the silence. David spent years running from Saul before he became king. From an earthly perspective, it might have seemed like unnecessary suffering. But God was developing him, teaching him how to lead, how to trust, and how to wait for His timing. If David had taken the throne too soon, he would not have been the leader God intended him to be. Every battle, every cave he hid in, and every trial he faced were preparing him for the responsibility of kingship. Even in modern times, the same truth remains. There are seasons where doors seem to remain closed, where efforts seem fruitless, and where the future feels uncertain. But God is never idle. He is aligning the right opportunities, opening the right doors at the right time, and preparing hearts for what is to come. What feels like delay is often His mercy, ensuring that His people are ready to carry the blessings He is preparing to give. Trusting in God's unseen work requires faith. It means believing in His goodness even when circumstances suggest otherwise. It means holding on to His promises even when everything points in the opposite direction. It means remembering that He is never late, never absent, and never unaware of the struggles His people face. What is impossible to see now will one day be understood, and when that moment comes, it will be clear that He was working all along. Life often presents challenges that test faith, patience, and endurance. In those moments, it can be tempting to give up, to let go of the promises God has given, and then to assume that the struggle will never end. But throughout history, the greatest victories have always come to those who chose to persevere, to remain steadfast in their trust, and to continue walking in faith even when the path seemed uncertain. The breakthrough does not come to those who quit, but to those who endure. The blessing is on the other side of the hardship, and those who hold on will see the faithfulness of God in ways they never imagined. Noah spent decades building the ark before the first drop of rain ever fell. He faced ridicule, isolation, and doubt from those around him. Yet, he remained faithful to what God had commanded. If he had given up halfway through, he and his family would not have been saved. His perseverance led to the fulfillment of God's promise. Even when he did not see results immediately, he trusted that God would do what He said He would do. Abraham and Sarah waited years for the promise of a son. In their old age, when it seemed biologically impossible, God fulfilled His word and gave them Isaac. But they had to endure a long season of waiting, trusting that God's promise would come to pass in His perfect timing. If they had given up on believing, they would have missed the fulfillment of what God had prepared. Joshua and the Israelites faced an unusual command when they arrived at Jericho. Instead of attacking the city, they were told to march around it for 7 days. There was no immediate result, no visible sign that anything was changing. But they remained obedient. They kept marching. And on the 7th day, after their perseverance, the walls fell and the victory was theirs. If they had stopped on the 6th day, they would not have seen the breakthrough. The blessing came because they refused to quit. Paul endured countless hardships, imprisonment, beatings, shipwrecks, and opposition. Yet, he never wavered in his faith. He continued preaching, teaching, and spreading the gospel despite the cost. He understood that suffering was not a sign of failure, but a part of the journey. He knew that perseverance and faith would lead to an eternal reward, and he pressed on, never allowing difficulties to shake his trust in God's plan. Jesus, in the Garden of Gethsemane, faced the ultimate test of perseverance. He knew the suffering that awaited him on the cross. He could have turned away, but he remained faithful to the mission set before him. Because of his endurance, salvation was made available to the world. His example demonstrates that perseverance is not just about enduring hardship, it is a greater purpose beyond the pain. There are many moments in life when circumstances seem impossible, when prayers appear unanswered, and when faith is challenged. In those moments, the choice must be made to give up or to press forward. Many people quit too soon, walking away from their blessings just before the breakthrough arrives. But those who continue, who trust, who hold on despite what they see will witness God's faithfulness in ways they never expected. God's timing is not always understood, but it is always perfect. What seems like a delay is often a time of preparation. What appears to be a setback is frequently positioning for something greater. The waiting is not wasted. The struggle is not in vain. Every difficulty is shaping, refining, and preparing for what is to come. Faith is not just believing when things are easy, it is holding on when everything seems uncertain. It is continuing to pray when the answer has not yet come. It is moving forward even when the path is unclear. Those who remain steadfast, who trust through the trials, and who refuse to let go of God's promises will see His blessings unfold in ways beyond anything they could have imagined. The breakthrough is coming, and those who endure will see it with their own eyes. Through every trial, every hardship, and every season of waiting, God is at work. His blessings are not withheld, but rather they are being prepared for the right time and for those who are ready to receive them. The struggles of today are not signs of defeat, they are stepping stones toward the victories of tomorrow. Every tear, every prayer, and every moment of perseverance is shaping a deeper faith, a stronger character, and a heart that is fully dependent on Him. God's greatest blessings often come after hardships because He is more concerned with shaping who we are than simply giving us what we want. He refines, He strengthens, and He positions His people so that when the blessing arrives, it does not just come as a gift, it comes with the ability to sustain it, to steward it, and to use it for His glory. No trial is wasted, no pain is meaningless, and no waiting season is in vain. Those who hold on to faith, who trust in His unseen hand, and who endure with unwavering perseverance will see His goodness in ways they never imagined. The breakthrough is coming, the promise is on the horizon, and blessing will be worth every moment of the journey. Stay faithful, stay steadfast, and watch as God's perfect plan unfolds in His perfect time.